Stop everything you're doing and listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a theory anymore. It's the aftermath. It is the first full day after the moment the silver market stopped behaving like a market and started behaving like a crime scene. It is Wednesday, January 21st, 2026, and while America slept, the global banking system began bleeding in public. Hundreds of billions in market value evaporated overnight. Silver didn't rise. It violently detached. Shanghai printed numbers that would have sounded insane 24 hours ago, and 5 major banks woke up staring at the kind of losses that end careers, end institutions, and end eras. And the most dangerous part is this. This is only day one. Because yesterday wasn't just another political headline. Yesterday was a trigger being pulled. Donald Trump took the oath, the cameras flashed, and the world watched the ceremony like it was a show. But the real event happened when a stack of paperwork waiting in silence turned into a weapon. Executive Order Warrant T892, titled Securing America's Strategic Monetary Metals Reserve, landed on the financial world like a silent earthquake. Not loud enough for mainstream media to treat it like a crisis, but powerful enough to fracture the foundation the system has been standing on for decades. This wasn't a memo, it was a demolition charge. And the explosion didn't happen on television. It happened inside the plumbing of the market, where most people never look. Here's what separates this from every other silver panic you've heard before. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a chart pattern on social media. It was a legal framework that changed the rules around silver in a way the banks can trade their way out of. The order declared silver a strategic monetary metal tied to national security. And that phrase may sound like bureaucratic noise, but in this world, words like that are keys. When you classify something as strategic and monetary, you don't just change how it's discussed. You change what can be done to it. You change how it can be shorted. You change how it can be stored. You change how it can be audited. You change who gets involved when the numbers don't add up. And then came the provision that should have made every trading desk go silent. A 90-day audit of all claimed silver holdings, connected to registered vaults, not by the exchanges, not by the banks, but by the Department of Defense alongside Treasury. Let that sink in. The United States military is now being positioned to verify the physical reality behind paper claims. That is not normal. That is not routine. That is what happens when someone in power suspects the truth is so bad that the usual auditors can be trusted to touch it. When the Pentagon shows up to count metal, it's not because they're curious, it's because they believe something is missing. But the real trap, the one that turned this from disruption into disaster, was the immediate freeze on new short positions in silver futures until the audit is complete. Existing shorts can be closed or rolled, but no fresh defense can be built. No new pressure can be manufactured. No new ceiling can be installed. That one sentence doesn't just inconvenience the banks, it cages them. Because the silver market has been controlled for decades by a concentrated short position so large, so deeply embedded, that insiders gave it a name that sounds like a warning whispered in a hallway. The death bag. The death bag isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a structural flaw disguised as sophistication. It answers what happens when a small number of powerful institutions build a mountain of paper promises on top of a physical market that cannot possibly support them. These short positions were accumulated over years, then defended, rolled, and recycled until they became part of the architecture of the market itself. And the problem with a short position is simple. Your potential loss is not capped. It doesn't stop at bad. It doesn't stop at painful. It doesn't stop at career-ending. It keeps growing as the price rises, and if the price rises violently, it becomes existential. Before yesterday, the death bag sat at roughly 215 million ounces of net short exposure across a small cluster of major banks. On paper, when silver was sitting around the old regime of pricing, that looked manageable. But the moment the ceiling is removed, the math turns predatory. At $200 an ounce, those shorts start bleeding tens of billions. At $500, the loss becomes a crater. At $2,000, it becomes a tombstone. And now the banks have been stripped of the one tactic they always relied on to survive, adding more shorts to regain control and push the price back down. That door is locked, the exit is narrowed, and the clock is ticking. If you're following this story and you want clear, no-nonsense breakdowns of what's happening as it unfolds, take 2 seconds to hit like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm this topic matters, it helps this channel grow, and it keeps you plugged into updates when the next domino falls. Because after what happened overnight, the next moves won't be gradual, they'll be violent. Now let me show you the moment theory became reality. While the United States was still in post-inauguration freeze, Asian markets opened into a vacuum. And when markets face uncertainty, they do the one thing they always do. They seek truth through price. Without the American paper system setting the tone, Tokyo opened silver far above what anyone would have called reasonable. That opening didn't hold. It exploded higher within minutes. Hong Kong joined, and the price climbed again, faster, sharper, as if something was forcing buyers to chase. But Shanghai was the real detonation, because Shanghai doesn't play the same game. Shanghai requires physical settlement. You don't buy the idea of silver there. You buy the metal. And when the Shanghai Gold Exchange opened, it didn't open with a debate. It opened with a verdict. Silver printed numbers that made the old paper prices look like theater. It crossed 1,000. It kept climbing. It moved like a market that had been held underwater for years and finally ripped free. This is the moment the world needs to understand. The physical market just declared independence from the paper market. And once that separation happens, everything changes, because the paper price becomes a story and the physical price becomes reality. That's why the phrase day one matters. We are not watching a rally. We are watching a system trying to reconcile two incompatible truths, the world of paper promises and the world of deliverable metal. Those two worlds can coexist only as long as nobody demands proof. Yesterday's order is proof being demanded, and proof is where fraud dies. Now, the banks are learning what happens when a market stops being a game and starts being an audit. Overnight, the damage wasn't confined to charts. It hit equity values. It hit confidence. It hit boardrooms. European trading saw major institutions drop hard, not because investors suddenly became emotional, but because investors understand the death bag math better than the public does. They understand margin calls. They understand collateral. They understand how quickly a derivative position can metastasize into a solvency event when the underlying asset refuses to cooperate. And the truly revealing detail isn't who is collapsing, it's who isn't. One major player, sitting in the center of Western finance, barely moved compared to the carnage. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens by positioning. It happens when someone saw the storm forming months ago, quietly stepped out of the path of the wave, and moved to the side that benefits from chaos instead of being consumed by it. In this kind of market, survival often looks like calm on the surface and preparation underneath. But across the rest of the landscape, the story is ugly. Pre-market indicators point to heavy hits on major attachment points of the old system, the ones that believed they could manage risk through models that assume silver never truly breaks free. Those models are now obsolete because the executive order didn't set a price. It did something far more dangerous for them. It targeted the mechanisms that allowed suppression to function. It froze the expansion of shorts. It placed military-grade verification over vault claims. And it instructed Treasury to study Silver A's role inside a modernized monetary framework based on true scarcity relative to above-ground inventories explicitly pointing to a wide valuation range that the market will now treat like a signal flare. That's why this event is being discussed inside emergency meetings, not as a commodity problem, but as a stability problem. Because silver is not just another metal. Silver is used everywhere. It's in electronics, energy, medicine, and industrial supply chains. It's the bloodstream of modern manufacturing. When its price rewrites itself, it forces a rewrite of costs across entire sectors. And when the price rewrites itself because the paper system collapses, it forces an even deeper question. What else is priced wrong because it was controlled through leverage and assumptions instead of reality? Here's the part people underestimate. The moment the world sees physical silver trading at one reality-based level in Asia, while American paper markets hesitate, halt, or attempt to reopen at an artificial number, the credibility gap becomes the story. And credibility gaps don't stay contained. They spread. They infect ETFs. They infect futures. They infect counterparty trust. They force institutions to ask whether a promise on paper is worth anything when a delivery requirement is approaching like a deadline. That's why the words audit begins January 27th matter. Not because a date on the calendar is magical, but because audits force accountability into places that have lived comfortably without it. If vaults hold exactly what they claim, then the market stabilizes into a new range after a brutal repricing. But if vaults don't hold what they claim, if bars are pledged twice, if inventories are thinner than advertised, then what you're watching now is not the peak, it's the prelude. And when people ask why the mainstream media is hesitant, why coverage feels delayed, why headlines are vague, the answer is simple. Media can report a price move. They can't easily report a structural failure in the system that funds and advertises them. They can't easily explain that a decade of normal life was built on a quiet imbalance. So they wait. They hope the storm passes. They hope the paper market reasserts control. But control is not a permanent state. It is something that must be maintained. And yesterday, the maintenance tools were taken away. The instinctive response most people have right now is comforting. The Federal Reserve will step in. There will be emergency liquidity. There will be a backdoor bailout. There will be some hidden mechanism that absorbs the losses, stabilizes the system, and returns everything to normal. That story has worked before, so people want it to work again. But this situation isn't T2008. The situation isn't TIA housing market bleeding slowly through bad loans. This is a concentrated short position being forced to confront a physical market that refuses to comply. And the order that triggered this was written with one purpose: to prevent the usual rescue narrative from protecting the institutions that built the trap. If the banks holding the death bag are forced to absorb these losses without the ability to socialize them through emergency facilities, then what you're witnessing is not volatility. It is an extinction event unfolding in the open. Because these losses do not politely wait for the next quarter. They demand collateral now. They demand margin now. They demand cash now. And if the numbers grow faster than balance sheets can respond, the system starts shedding parts of itself to stay alive. That's why leaked internal communications matter more than official statements. When a major institution privately tells high-value clients that prior price assumptions are no longer valid and that extreme targets are now on the table depending on audit findings, it reveals the truth they can admit publicly. The range of outcomes has widened beyond model control. In plain English, the people who run the risk systems are admitting they no longer trust the risk systems. And when that happens, you're not watching a market move. You're watching belief collapse. Now here is the most uncomfortable reality of all. If you are late to this, the issue isn't price. The issue is access. In a true reset, the metal doesn't merely become expensive. It becomes scarce. It becomes delayed. It becomes rationed. It becomes something you cannot simply click and purchase at will because the delivery mechanisms begin choking under demand. That's why seasoned participants aren't just thinking about buying more. They're thinking about verifying what they already own. They're thinking about custody. They're thinking about whether their exposure is a claim or possession. Because in moments like this, the difference between paper and physical is the difference between comfort and survival. So here's the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer in the comments, because it matters more than any price target. If the world is moving toward a system where strategic metals are treated like national security assets again, and if the old paper architecture is being forced into accountability, what happens to trust itself? What happens to the institutions built on leverage when a single audit can rewrite reality? And what happens to everyday people who believed the number on a screen was the same thing as ownership? Because that's the real battlefield. It's not just silver at 200, 500, or 2,000. It's the world deciding whether value is defined by claims or by custody, whether power is defined by paper or by possession, whether a financial system built on infinite expansion can survive a moment where a hard asset demands proof. History doesn't give many warning shots this loud. The banking system is not reacting this way because of panic. It's reacting this way because it recognizes a rare event. The rules of enforcement just changed. If enforcement changes, behavior changes. If behavior changes, price changes. And if price changes in a leveraged system, something breaks. We are now watching what breaks first. To understand what comes next, you have to widen your lens beyond today's chaos and see the pattern. There are moments in history when monetary reality shifts in a single stroke, and the world pretends it's just politics until the consequences arrive. In 1933, gold ownership was transformed by executive action, and people who thought it couldn't happen learned the hard way that impossible, upa'ar, is often just inconvenient for the powerful. In 1971, the gold window closed, and a new age of paper expansion began. Those weren't just policy moves, they were tectonic shifts in how value was defined. Now the world is staring at another inflection point, not because someone waved a magic wand and set a price, but because the mechanisms that kept a hard asset suppressed are being challenged at the structural level. When you remove the ceiling from a market that has been compressed for decades and you trap a gigantic short position behind a locked door, price discovery does not arrive politely. It arrives like a flood. Over the next 72 hours, this story will intensify. American markets will attempt to open into a reality they didn't price in. Mining stocks will whip like they're attached to a live wire. Paper instruments will face pressure from investors demanding clarity on what they truly own. The public narrative will be stability, reassurance, and control. But behind closed doors, the real conversation will be about exposure, inventory, and the consequences of a vault audit conducted under the weight of national security. And if the audit reveals clean numbers, the system survives a brutal repricing and limps into a new era. But if the audit reveals shortfalls, double-pledged bars, or inventories that do not match claims, then today's shock will be remembered as the calm before the real storm. Because the moment the world realizes the paper market was larger than the physical market it claimed to represent, it won't be a debate anymore. It will be a run. This is the part where people ask what to do. And the honest answer is that the time for easy positioning was when the world laughed at silver, when it was treated like a sideshow, when it sat under the weight of suppression and complacency. If you prepared early, you're not watching this with fear. You are watching it with grim recognition. If you didn't, then the next phase is not about chasing a number. It's about thinking clearly, avoiding panic, and understanding that in a reset, the most valuable thing is not the price. It's the ability to act while others are frozen. Because the truth is, this isn't just about silver. Silver is the catalyst. The deeper story is the collapse of credibility in the post-1971 system. A system that thrived on infinite paper expansion, on leverage layered on leverage, on a belief that hard limits could be managed forever through policy and optics. That belief is now being tested by something ancient and unforgiving: scarcity. You cannot print it. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot model it away when the market demands delivery. Day one has already rewritten the scoreboard. The death bag is bleeding. Banks are absorbing losses they cannot publicly admit. Physical pricing has separated from paper theater. And the people who spent decades telling you silver was just another industrial commodity are now watching it behave like what it has always been beneath the surface: money. This is the Money and Empire's Aftermath report for January 21st, 2026, the first day after the ceiling was removed, the first day the old game stopped working. And if you understand what you just heard, then you understand the most important sentence of all. This is only day one.